Okay, I think that was actually a very good introduction by Pradeep in terms of how this presentation is going to fit in. And this is going to be a little different. One of the things I realized as I was preparing it, and I actually did a few little revisions this morning, is that I think this may be so far the first presentation that doesn't have a single number in it. So maybe some people will welcome that kind of a change. It's going to be a little bit perhaps a different shift in the way of thinking, but as Pradeep said, I think it's very necessary. And basically the objective of this short session, I won't talk for very long, is to break down this question of capacity development. That sometimes we throw around the words capacity building or capacity development, and in some scenarios, people equate capacity building with training. That capacity building happens when you have training. But I think that people won't argue that it's much more than that. In fact, I would go as far as to say that capacity development, which is the term I tend to use, is actually about change. That we wouldn't be here today if it wasn't perceived or agreed that some change needed to happen. We're talking about it specifically in the area of climate change adaptation, which is something I'm not an expert in, I have to admit. But if it wasn't thought that there needs to be a change, then we wouldn't be here. And change is complex. So to think about a kind of cause and effect way of capacity building to happen, that if we train this many people, then this change will happen, is not always, but is quite often a little bit too simplistic for the world that we live in. So I'll just start. I actually took this directly from the concept note that everyone has. It's on the first page. It's a little bit of a simplistic lifting, but I just put the highlight in that, the purpose of this program that we're here discussing today is to develop technical skills. I highlighted that. But what I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about is how technical skills fit into a bigger system. And more broadly, how do we ensure that an investment and a thinking about technical skills and the appropriateness of technical skills, how can we make sure that an investment in a technical capacity development program can have the biggest possible impact on the larger change that we want to see happen? Because I think we'll all agree that we don't invest in technical skills or we don't do trainings just for the sake of doing that. It's because we want something to happen down the line. And that's where the complexity comes in. So I've just put a couple of things up here about this question of how do we ensure things that have an impact that we're going to be working on in terms of looking ahead to, as you're thinking about what your country needs are, not only taking into account and trying to absorb and synthesize all of the presentations that have happened in the last day and a half, a number of which have been quite specific, quite scientific, quite technical, very relevant without question, but how do we ensure that actually those ideas and those needs on the technical side can also be embedded within a broader system to ensure that any sort of, that this capacity building program is not a one-off thing, but it actually meets a real need and that it's designed well enough so that the technical part can be absorbed and support the change that needs to happen. And I put a second hash here, which means one thing that I would encourage us to do is to not only think about what the technical needs are in the area of climate change adaptation, but also how that fits within the functional capacities, which I'll come to explain in just a moment, and also within broader systems. And in addition to that, as I just mentioned, making the link to saying, okay, how can the program that your countries have an opportunity to participate in, what is the link with having an 18-month or 24-month program? How can the impact of that be sustainable? How can the systems or the thinking be sustainable? And how can we make sure that it's not capacity building just for the sake of doing capacity building, but actually supporting in your own specific context, in your own specific country, the climate change adaptation needs, the development results that will ultimately are the objective actually of climate change adaptation. So the first thing I'd like to discuss is just to go a little bit more in detail about when we talk about technical and functional capacities, what are we talking about? I'm sure that there's a lot of different definitions. UNDP has one definition. I'm not going to say, promote one or the other. I think that the distinction is this. Technical capacities are very specific skills within a sector. So it could include things like economic modeling or engineering or law or medicine. Functional capacities are cross-cutting. Functional capacities enable the use of the technical skills. So this kind of, I think, gives a bigger picture of when we talk about functional being cross-cutting, what exactly are we talking about? And what has always had meaning for me is that functional capacities are relevant for every sector and every organization. You can think of any organization, and they will in some ways need to engage with their beneficiaries, engage with their stakeholders, make a plan, make a strategic plan for what activities they're going to do. They need to formulate their own strategy, policy. They need to manage their budget. They need to think about financial resources. They need to monitor and evaluate how effective their activities were. Those are functional capacities. It's kind of the glue that holds together any sort of organization or institution. Also, I think this is quite relevant if we talk about climate change. Functional capacities include being able to collaborate with diverse stakeholders and manage complexity. And I mention that in the context of climate change because it's so complex. It's not just about science, it's not just about environment. It's about international relations, it's about trade, it's about governance, it's about land tenure. I mean, there's so much complexity if we talk about climate change. If you put that up against technical capacities, hopefully you can see the difference between what I'm saying. The technical capacities would include, for example, economic modeling or agricultural approaches, but that even a Ministry of Agriculture, even a Ministry of Rural Development and Infrastructure, while they will need specific technical capacities within that institution or organization, that ministry, they're also going to need the functional capacities. So the point here is that there needs to be a balance between thinking through what are the needs in terms of the technical capacities, but have we also given enough attention to the functional part to make sure that those technical capacities and skills that we invest in can be used to the greatest possible impact? Okay. There are a lot of examples where there's been an investment in technical capacities with good intention without thinking through enough. What is the broader system? What are the functional capacities that are needed? I actually made note of a few. For example, I was in Afghanistan a few weeks ago, and I was involved in a conversation where there was a discussion about the need to train more teachers in Afghanistan. And the government of India had actually offered to support a training of a number of Afghan teachers in India on teaching methods, on very technical areas. And so there was a lot of enthusiasm, and UNDP was kind of involved in helping to broker this. But as the discussion went on, it was realized that, okay, even if we have a number of teachers who are trained, has there been enough thinking about is the budget there to pay their salaries? How, are the schools there that we're going to put them in? How are we going to deal with accreditation? Is that going to fit within our accreditation? These are the type of things that sometimes there's a jump towards, this is a great opportunity, we can have more teachers trained, without actually thinking through, is there the absorptive capacity within the system to make the best use of this opportunity? Another example was in Timor-Leste, in terms of a shortage of doctors, that there was a quite large-scale program developed between Timor-Leste and Cuba to actually have Timorese go to Cuba and receive medical training. Again, without actually thinking through, okay, have we thought through where these doctors are going to be, where the clinics are, accreditation, and so on and so forth. A third example that I recently heard actually was in the country of Djibouti and had to do with civil aviation, where a number of people from that country went and were trained in the latest technologies in terms of air traffic control, in terms of radar, using equipment, but again, systems not put in place, so that when they actually many of them never went back to their country. There was greater opportunities for them elsewhere, so the entire objective actually, it was, maybe good for those people, but not good for, for actually meeting the overall objective. So the point here, of course, and I want to be very clear, in no way am I suggesting that the technical part is not important. I think that you can see that it's just about making sure that there's a balance between thinking through, having an opportunity to really build technical capacities. Is the system in place to absorb it? Okay. It's very similar. I mean, one distinction that is sometimes helpful for unpacking what we mean by capacity development as a process. One kind of binary is the technical and functional. I think this also can, for those who relate more to graphs, maybe this is also helpful. That yes, individual level capacities are critical, but each level of the organizational and enabling environment impacts on each other. Usually we don't get the results of any capacity development program. Usually we don't get the expected results unless in some way we're thinking about what are the 3 levels that are coming into this. If we have individuals who are very, very skilled, are there the organizational structures in order to support them to use those skills? And even broader, and this has come up I think in a number of different ways, at the policy level, legislation, mandates of different organizations, is there clarity on this so that the individuals can use their skills towards the desired change? Actually, one more point on this. If you look at the enabling environment, there's a few kind of illustrative examples: policies, laws, mandates. Power relations, social norms. And this, I think, came, Ratin's introductory remarks mentioned about political will. That again, sometimes there's a danger in making assumptions that if we have a well-designed program of training or capacity development that even looks at multiple levels, it's not always just hard factors of making sure the policies are in place, making sure the rules are in place, making sure the legislation and laws are in place to support it. There's a lot of other things that impact on change. There's different political agendas, there are different power structures. As soon as we start to talk about money, there's many different complexities that come in. So these are the type of things that I think I'm just trying to introduce so that as you kind of go into your working groups and think about what your country's needs are in relation to this specific opportunity, to try to think about what some of these broader systems, broader institutional context, and the context of your country are. It's going to be different for every context. It's going to be different for every organization. Okay, I'm not going to go in great depth, but these are some of the things that sometimes we find if we invest in these kind of graphics on the left, they can actually have quite a big impact on the capacity development process achieving the desired result. They're just, again, some kind of ideas for breaking down what capacity development is. One is institutional arrangements and systems, which I've talked some about. Are there the kind of, are there the coordination mechanisms that are needed between different ministries, between civil society groups? What is the communication between local level, subnational level, national level? Leadership. Leadership is not just about individuals. It's not just about people who are in positions of power. But the example I would give is that if we don't think about leadership in the context of trying to bring about a change, in an absence of leadership, everything else can be in place. But if the minister doesn't believe that it's a worthwhile thing to do, I think you probably know from your own countries and contexts that can almost sink the whole thing, or political will. So leadership is really key. Knowledge, this is where training fits in, and certainly it's not to be diminished. I mean, whether it's trainings, whether it's on-the-job training, whether it's higher education, tertiary education, many different ways of kind of not only investing in individuals' knowledge and skills, but also systems of sharing knowledge. And finally, accountability. I'm actually going to skip through this example in the interest of time. Okay, this is pretty much coming to my final slide, final couple slides. And what I'm just going to show on this slide is to try to make the point again that as you're thinking about your country's needs in terms of capacity development for this a capacity building program on climate change adaptation, to just kind of try to drive home this point of not to think about it as, or I would encourage you not to think about it as, let's just think about who needs to be trained or whose capacities need to be strengthened, or even which agencies or which organizations need to have stronger capacities in the area of climate change adaptation, but making the link between, at that level, with what is the change in the bigger picture. How does that actually link with the desired result, right? And the reason for emphasizing this is because, having worked a couple years in the area of capacity development, oftentimes we just stop too soon and we just say, okay, the purpose is to have, this department be able to do their job better, without asking the question of why, what is the purpose of that, and how is that going to happen. So I just am going to show a kind of graphic here which tries to illustrate that point alone, to try to think about what is the ultimate purpose, and therefore what are some of the complexities that come into making that happen. So this is basically a results chain. This is a generic example, but if you start from the bottom, that's capacity development processes, okay? This is capacity assessments, it's diagnoses, it's trainings, it's activities and inputs. But what does it need to lead to? It needs to lead to increased capacity in terms of better functioning systems, in terms of better functioning structures, stronger institutional arrangements, leadership, and so forth. But why? We don't stop there. We don't stop with just having a better system. Improve performance. That in your ministry, in a ministry, or across many, need to perform better, more effectively, more efficiently, which leads to changes in behavior and ultimately to changes in people's lives. I tried to make this an example which is linked to climate change adaptation. I hope that this resonates. Like I said, I'm not an expert, but I've tried to make it specific. So if we link it to our discussions here, first, we're analyzing capacity needs related to climate change adaptation. That's what we're doing right now, which is going to lead, to coming up with strategies for how to address them, which will include investment in technical skills, technical capacities. The next level will be an increased capacity in terms of systems related to climate change adaptation. For example, planning and budgeting systems, which is discussed at length here, are strengthened in multiple institutions related, in the broader sense of climate change, not just one ministry, but as you know, multiple, multi-stakeholder, multiple across the sector. Improved performance. So what could that lead to? It's just an example. Local government plans and budgets more effectively reflect climate change adaptation needs, or provincial agriculture extension services, reflect these plans. Local farmers adapt their practices to reflect this, which could lead to an increase in more resilient food security. It's just one example, but trying to actually show, if we talk about a capacity development program, what is the big picture in terms of change. The capacity development program we're talking about here is not going to be the only input that's going to lead to that. So that's not what I'm suggesting. It's a complex system. There's many contributions. There's things that are already happening in your countries. But to at least try to keep the picture of, it's not capacity development just for the sake of capacity development. A few just kind of in summary of takeaway points. Like I said, keeping in mind the balance and the link between the technical and the functional. There's no formula. It's going to be different in every situation. Maybe there is not a need. Maybe the functional capacities, maybe the systems of budgeting, of planning are very good, and it really is the technical capacities that need strengthening. But to at least think about, in your context, what is the balance in terms of where the needs are. Keeping in mind the three levels, what is the balance needed in terms of looking at strengthening, individual skills and competencies, the organizational systems, processes, rules, regulations, and in the enabling environment, the policy level, the political will. Capacity development is a process. It's not a one-time thing. Training is a strategy that can support capacity development. Training does not equal capacity development. So it's a process and it's complex. It involves both hard and soft factors. Again, this is where context is everything. The soft factors in your country, it could be about decision-making processes. It could be about hierarchy. It could be about, power structures, traditions. And because of this complexity, we need to be careful about making assumptions of cause and effect. You know, the obvious example is if we train these people, it will have this big effect. Maybe, but probably not. If we train these people, it will have X effect, that they'll be able to use those skills, but what contribution does it make to the bigger picture? And then this is just the final slide, which I put up, which will hopefully kind of help you think through some of this as you go into your working groups, as you actually start to identify needs. There's, because I've seen that there's a sheet which is, really about identifying needs in terms of which sectors need to be emphasized, what are the biggest threats in your country, what are the skills most important for your staff, cost-benefit analysis, and so forth. Very important, but just to try to keep somewhere in your thinking, is there also support needed to any of the things that I've discussed? Because there are also tools and methodologies which can support that. There's stakeholder mapping tools. There's UNDP has a very robust capacity assessment tool. There's political economy analysis. There's change management. So there's many tools and methodologies which also can support these, thinking through these broader systems as well. So just to keep that in mind in terms of, okay, how can the next kind of 18 months, 24 months program have the biggest impact in terms of what the result you want is, and to keep a balance.